Embassy of the Dead, Chapter 40, The Talking Hare. Mawkins descended the stairs. The fog that licked out from beneath his robes dispersed in his wake and gathered in the corners of the stone chamber. Seen close up and in an enclosed space, he was even more forbidding. He was so tall that his head almost touched the ceiling, and he towered over them all, his face still unseeable in the utter shadow of his hood. The room waited, everyone in it too terrified to move. The dead hair around Mawkins' neck twitched. With a sudden jerk of its head, its milky eyes flicked open. Then, to Jake's horror, it opened its mouth and began to speak. Though Jake could understand the meaning of the words, the voice that rattled from the hare's mouth wasn't of this world. "Where is the finger?" It took Jake a moment to compose himself and find his own voice again. He stepped forward. "It's here." He held out the wriggling finger on a flat palm. "It's mine!" screamed Good Morning. He lurched forward, then stopped suddenly at the sound of a new voice from the top of the stairs. "Actually, I think that item is the property of the Embassy of the Dead." 3 ghosts stood at the top of the steps. A woman in jodhpurs and a riding hat entered the chamber and stood sternly with her hands on her hips and a frown on her face. Behind her stood a man in bloody-stained military clothes and an officious-looking woman in glasses holding a clipboard. And here they are. "Ambassador," said Good Morning with a huge smile on his face. Then, looking at the man, "Captain." He ran a hand nervously through his hair. "I'm glad you're both here at last to sort this mess." "Button it," said the ambassador. The woman with the clipboard bustled her way to the front. "Which one of you is Jake Green?" she asked. "I am," said Jake sheepishly. "I believe we spoke earlier. My name is Maureen Perkins, personal assistant to the ambassador." Jake nodded dumbly. "I've a section 7.3b death order here with your name on it," she said. She looked over at Stiffkey. "And Albert Stiffkey, ghost?" Stiffkey nodded grimly. "Aye, that's me, but the boy ain't nothing to do with this business. It's my fault, and my fault alone." Maureen tutted. "An unfortunate business indeed. It's always a shame to send a living child to the eternal void. Still, rules are rules." Here Maureen paused for a moment, got a tissue from her pocket and blew her nose. She looked up again. "Could I have the finger, please?" Jake went to pass it to her. "Goodness, no, in the box, child. I don't want to touch it." Cora picked up the box and Jake replaced the finger. He looked at Good Morning, whose expression was unreadable. Clearly he was outnumbered, but he was also desperate and might try anything. Jake carefully closed the lid and handed the box to Maureen, who passed it to the ambassador. "We've been following the situation for a while, Good Morning," said the ambassador, "wondering why you hadn't called us in. But thanks to Jake alerting us, I think we do now have the full picture. It seems you've betrayed us and have been plotting to free Fenris with no regard for the danger that poses to both the earthly plane and the afterworld." "Absolutely not. I've simply been—" "Enough!" boomed the ambassador, and the mausoleum seemed to shake at her voice. "The game is up, Good Morning. I'm afraid your man Rayburn, as insensitive as he is to the presence of ghosts, turned out to be quite talkative when faced with the captain." The captain smiled. "I'm afraid, Good Morning, your time at the embassy is over." "Well, I'm afraid it's too late to stop me now," shouted Good Morning. He held open his palms towards Mawkins and uttered an incantation. Nothing happened. Mawkins took a step towards Good Morning. "No, wait, that's not it," Good Morning stuttered and tried the chant again, stumbling on his words. Maureen began reading from her clipboard. "Section 56C, unauthorised use of incantations and old magic," she said. Mawkins took another step forward. "Section 45C, activities pertaining or belonging to an organisation and or person actively involved in overthrowing the embassy." And another. "Section 24.5.1,
harming a member of the living, subsection 12, attempted murder.
She shook her head crossly.
Really, unto a good morning, you've racked up an impressive tally of infringements. I'd say I've got more than enough evidence to proceed without further paperwork. Mawkins, if you would be so kind.
A terrified good morning was now backed against the wall as Mawkins advanced on him. The sucking void between Mawkins's hands was picking up pace now. No, wait, please. The dead hare scratched its whiskers with its paw.
Goodbye.
Mawkins raised his hands, and then, with a sudden sweeping movement, his scythe appeared and sliced a deep cut in the air. Jake could only stare into the eternal blackness, a void that continued forever. A cry grabbed his attention back to his own side of the cut. Good morning was being dragged towards the hole. He stumbled, fingernails raking the dirt floor of the mausoleum. No, he pleaded, not this, not the eternal void. His hand reached out for Jake's ankle, but Stiffkey batted it away with his shovel. Good morning lost his purchase on the soil and was sucked into the hole. Mawkins waved a hand and the cut in the air healed. Stiffkey took off his hat and lowered his head. There ain't no one that deserves the void, not even Mr. Good Morning. Maureen tore a sheet from her clipboard and held it out for Stiffkey to take.
But we must do things according to the letter of the law, mustn't we?
Stiffkey nodded grimly, taking the sheet and folding it neatly. Aye, that we must, Mrs. Perkins.
Ms., she corrected, Albert Stiffkey. This certificate authorises me to send you to the eternal void. Do you accept your fate?
Mawkins turned towards the ghost, raising his hands to summon his scythe.
That's not fair, shouted Cora. Well, Miss Sanderford, as you well know, life isn't always fair, but we must abide by the rules, said Maureen, gently but firmly. And as you have had unauthorised contact with an unlicensed member of the living, you have barely escaped the void yourself. It's only because you are a possessor tied to your trophy and technically you were summoned that your presence here is not entirely your own fault. Goodness knows how Ezekiel got that so wrong.
She shook her head, making a note on her clipboard.
Thank you, said Cora, but it's still not fair. Jake, Stiffkey, they really were trying to do the right thing.
Stiffkey stepped forward. It's all right, child. Miss Perkins be right. Rules are rules, and I be accepting of my fate, and only hope the eternal void ain't worse than the eternal longings. He frowned and reached a long arm towards Jake. Some dirt fell from his jacket sleeve and gathered in a heap at Jake's feet. But if this young lad is to be sent to the void for my mistakes, then them rules ain't worth the paper they be written on. Maureen shook her head.
I'm afraid the time to register an appeal to a death order has passed. You would have needed to have handed in Form AQ23 within 24 hours of the death order being issued.
Now Jake stepped forward. Something Mr. Sixsmith had said in the afterworld reverberated around his head.
If he shops you and you go to the void first, then he's not in trouble any more.
Wait, shouted Jake. The only reason you're sending Stiffkey to the void is because he's in contact with an unlicensed member of the living, me, right?
That is correct, replied Maureen.
And so if you send me to the void first, I'll no longer be living and he'll be pardoned? Jake racked his brain for the final detail in his conversation with Mr. Sixsmith, then remembered. Subsection C, I believe. Maureen frowned, then flicked through the pages on her clipboard.
Well, it's been a while since subsection C has been invoked. In fact, I'm not sure that it ever has, but you are correct.
Jake stepped between the two ghosts. Then send me to the void first, he pleaded. He looked up at his old friend. Better one of us go than both. Stiffkey stared, as though he'd been struck by lightning. No, I won't let it happen, boy. Maureen sighed.
Well, let's get it over with then. If you'd like to go first, Mr. Stiffkey.
Stiffkey nodded. If I might just be allowed a moment, he said, clearing his throat. I've already lost a son, and I never got to tell him how I felt before I died, not really. Us undertakers ain't good at showing their feelings, and Jake, though you ain't my true son, I love you like you were. He smiled sadly at Jake. I'm glad at least to be able to do it right this time and tell you before I be going on my way."
"Very touching," said Maureen, looking up from her clipboard. "Will that be all?"
Stiffkey nodded and closed his eyes in preparation. But as Mawkins took a step towards him and the scythe hovered ominously in the air, a sudden thought struck Jake. "Stiffkey, did you never tell your son you loved him?" he said.
"No, boy, I didn't,"
said the ghost, shaking his head. "Say it now, Stiffkey," said Jake excitedly. "Say it out loud, shout it, go on." And Stiffkey looked down at him, at once knowing what Jake meant. His eyes lit up. He took off his top hat and brushed some dirt from the rim, and now tears were streaming down his face. He raised his arms, looking up at the ceiling, and shouted, "I love you, Sidney! I love you, my son!" And just as the void was about to consume him, Stiffkey began to fade. Not from the extremities, not from his top hat, nor his fingers, nor his feet, but from the middle, his heart.
"What's happening?" said Cora in a hushed voice.
Mawkins lowered his hand. The void disappeared. "He's been undone," said Jake, tears falling down his own cheeks. Stiffkey's eyes flicked open and a huge smile spread across his face, a look of pure childlike joy.
"I'm off to see my boy. You did it, Jake. You've untied the Gordian knot. Thank you. You saved us both."
Jake blinked and Stiffkey held out a fading hand towards him.
"You be an undoer now, boy. Good luck and goodbye."
"Goodbye, Stiffkey," said Jake, reaching out for his friend's hand. But where their fingers should have met, now his hand passed through air. Albert Stiffkey had left the earthly plane forever. Maureen shrugged and tucked her clipboard beneath her arm.
"Well, that's that then. You're an undoer, and the 7.3 death order is invalidated as you are now licensed."
She seemed a little put out. Jake and Cora looked at each other and broke into huge smiles. She ran over to him and they hugged and jumped up and down.
"You did it," said Cora. "You really did it." "Not so fast,"
came a stern voice. Jake and Cora stopped and turned. It was the ambassador, still standing, hand on hip. She was eyeing Jake steadily.
"You have just managed to undo Stiffkey, and given you have also managed to ensure the safe return of the finger, that does seem to be enough in this instance to save you from the eternal void."
Jake smiled and nodded gratefully. "Thank you, Ambassador."
"But," she went on, raising a finger, "you are not out of trouble yet. You have still led the embassy on a wild goose chase across the country, all the time meddling in the affairs of the dead."
She wagged her finger at him.
"All with the intention of saving your own skin. Yet, had you been able to think about anything other than yourself, you might have considered that the entire earthly plane and all its inhabitants were in the gravest danger."
Jake shuffled his feet.
"Any honourable person would have known that the only correct course of action would have been to report immediately to the embassy and deliver the finger back to safety."
Cora went to say something, but a glare from the ambassador was enough to silence her.
"Have you stopped to consider what would have happened if we had arrived a moment later?"
Jake stood there speechless, unable to say anything.
"You may have qualified for an undoer's license, but there's a reason why the embassy hasn't ever employed a living child before. A child's inability to see beyond their own existence on the earthly plane never ceases to disappoint." She pursed her lips. "I'm very much hoping I won't see you again. At least not until you're dead. Now go home."
And with a click of her fingers, the ambassador, the captain, and Maureen Perkins all disappeared.